Okay, so part two in our series is going to focus on indoor growing, and that will be more on kind of soil-based mediums is what will be the focus today. The last one was on hydroponics, so growing in water with solutions and fertilizers added into the water as the medium of growing. I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining today from the homelands of the Lekwungen peoples, modern-day Songhees and Esquimalt nations. So just a little bit about Farm to School BC. It's a program that brings healthy, local, sustainable food into schools across British Columbia. We provide students with hands-on learning opportunities that develop food literacy while strengthening local food systems and enhancing school and community connectedness. And we are a program of the Public Health Association of BC and supported by the province of British Columbia. A major aspect of the work we do is through our regional animators who are living and working within the following hubs you see there in the school districts. But Farm to School also supports outside of those school districts through our resources we create, through our annual granting stream, through our webinar series, etc. But if you happen to reside in any of these school districts and you don't know, you should reach out to one of our community animators. You can find that information on our website and about us, and we'll show the team page and all the different emails for each of the animators. So this webinar series is a partnership between Farm to School BC and Farm to Cafeteria Canada. We've partnered on lots of projects over the years. Farm to Cafeteria Canada is a national organization. They hosted the first in this two-part series on hydroponics. And I will pass it over to Jenna, who's coming here to represent Farm to Cafeteria Canada. So over to you, Jenna.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so if you weren't able to join us last week, Farm to Cafeteria Canada is a pan-Canadian nonprofit charitable organization whose purpose is to transform how food is experienced, learned, and celebrated in all schools across Canada. And we take a partnership-based approach to grow the capacity of diverse school communities across the country to foster vibrant school food systems by connecting students to the food and local food systems that produce it. And we do this by focusing on three elements that make up the farm to school approach. Next slide. And yeah, so those three elements are hands-on learning, school and community connectedness, and healthy local food in schools. And both Farm to School BC and Farm to Cafeteria Canada use this like comprehensive and flexible lens to view school food. Next slide. And we know that like with the diversity of communities and schools across Canada, whether the community is urban or rural or coastal or interior or many other factors affect how the farm to school approach comes to life in each school. So we came up with this graphic to kind of show a couple of the very different ways that farm to school can come to life, and sometimes that does not include a farm at all. Yeah, so thanks, Marcus. You can come back.
Thanks, Jenna. Okay, so let's get into it. Part two of Indoor Growing in the Classroom webinar series. Today, the presenters will be myself, Marcus Laub. I'm Provincial Manager of Farm to School BC. I have about 14 years of experience supporting school food initiatives, working in classrooms, working in community gardens, et cetera, both in Quebec and British Columbia. And we also have Paul Denby joining us today, an educator from Arthur Hatton Elementary School. Paul and his grade 5-6 classroom at Arthur Hatton have been growing microgreens for 10 years. Together, they sell microgreens to local restaurants weekly, oversee a large school garden, and attend the farmers market. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'll be covering. Benefits of indoor growing, some growing models, tools, engaging students, some aspects of maintenance, and some fundraiser options. So feel free to add any comments you might have into the chat as I'm presenting. I'm going to be pausing from time to time, and Madison, who's also joined from our staff, is going to be keeping an eye on that chat, and she will fire over some questions when we see some. So Yeah, so feel free. And also after I present, Paul will present, and then we are planning to leave about 10 minutes or so for additional questions and discussion. So you'll also have the opportunity to raise your hand and maybe ask a more detailed question if the thought of typing it all out into the chat is not pleasing. So the benefits of indoor growing are many, I would say. Obviously, having plants growing in the classroom beautifies the classroom. It introduces students to growing and responsibility. It can save money for the garden on an annual basis. Obviously, growing seeds can be very affordable rather than going to a farmer's market purchasing seedlings or wherever else you might get them. You can grow really unique varieties that sometimes are difficult to find at a store or at a farmer's market because there's many more varieties that are out there that you don't regularly see that aren't common, popular sellers. You can always apply organic principles if that's of interest to you, and you can use them to start fundraisers. There's many different growing models that you can use. There's ones that you can buy that are ready-made, or you can build your own, such as what you see here with a simple PVC pipe on the left. They all essentially do the same job in principle. Really all it comes down to is just how many you want to be growing, what kind of capacity and time you might have. Building your own or hiring someone to do so can allow you to add a little personal touch, such as the one you see here in the picture. So this was a kind of a design I came up with two of my carpenter friends back many years ago. And it was very specific to accommodate 4 trays on each row, that the tables actually slide out so it'd be easy to water. There's a storage space in the bottom, and it was, pretty fancy, I would say, for us. But it does pose problems. There were some things we didn't consider. As you see, these tomato plants are now starting to get too big for the space, and they're touching the light. So we thought it was going to be enough space, and it didn't. And so that was a little something that we learned there, is that we would have wished we built it a little bit taller. I really recommend just kind of the metal rack option. They're very easy to find. So you can hang the lights from the actual bars. They don't rust. If you get the ones with wheels, you can move them around from classroom to classroom. Or if you're having a parent-teacher night, it can roll right out into the hallway and show off your seedlings. It's a great option here too. You can actually sort of raise and adjust these levels of these, but once you sort of establish them in a position, it's not the most fun to move, but that's definitely a pretty affordable. You can set it up in like 20 minutes. They're at Costco and places like that. Here's just a little wooden home model that I built years ago that cost like $20 or something, with 2x4s, a couple shop lights hanging from chain. It worked perfect because the ballasts of these lights is pretty much exactly 48 inches, which allows 4 trays to kind of set in there. And that's why I wanted to control over kind of the size. So I built it to be like that. And so that was just kind of a very cheap way of getting going and starting seedlings in my own home. Here's another example of them hanging off of the metal one. And you can see that they're using zip ties there, which can be problematic because then you can't really move them as easy. You would have to cut them. But they might also just want it to be like this because they're maybe only germinating that sort of tray right there. And then maybe it gets moved to a different spot where the lights can move. But just showing an example of what it could look like if you wanted to use these metal trays here. If you were wanting to build, a wooden one like I showed before, really, these are the only tools that are needed. Very simple, takes maybe an hour or something. So it's kind of something that anyone could do and could do with students as well, which I did build these with students before, and they loved the ability to use some of these tools safely, obviously. But, that's something that you could think of building into the whole process. Overall, the other materials that you're going to use for growing this, the main kind of grow station, are just simple lights. I found that any sort of shop ballast light with full spectrum bulbs, just checking in at any sort of store that sells them, they can recommend. But I didn't find a whole lot of difference between growing with different bulbs. And in a lot of my research, it just pointed to, especially with seedlings, not really requiring a special light. Just showing that that little hook there with the chains, because as the seedlings are growing up, you're going to want to keep adjusting the light. And then a regular timer is going to be important, maybe an extension cord. Paul's going to talk a little bit more about this in his presentation too, about the specific lights he uses. So in terms of the materials to actually grow the seedlings, you can use, these are the different kinds of items you can use here. You're going to use some sort of seedling mix, some sort of manure or earthworms castings. You're going to have different trays that are going to hold, and you're going to want some sort of watering pump spray action. I really love these pump sprays. They make it really easy for the kids to do. You give it a few pumps and then you just hold it down, and it really speeds up the process a lot. The different trays that you can start seedlings in for in the classroom, if usually on the left is where you would start it and germinate it for the first 4 weeks or something, and then you would sort of transfer it over into the larger cell where it kind of comes to maturity up until the point that it goes out into the garden. But I've seen some people just skip that first stage and start it in the big one if they know that's what it's going to end up in. The only real thing to watch out for is just to make sure you water heavily enough the larger seedling tray on the right that you see there, because the bottom can dry out if you're just doing surface watering, whereas on the left, it tends to soak all of the medium and has a much higher chance of successful germination. So that's just a little bit of my experience, but really anything such as squash, any cucumbers, peas or beans, you can start in a bigger tray. So you don't need to do that little tray because you're going to just go from there straight outdoors. So just a little kind of image of what I recommend for the different cells. So some of the typical plants, I would start tomato, peppers, lettuce, kale, basil in the left. And I would start sort of anything that's in that squash family in the right. Squash family plants don't like to be transplanted a lot, so I don't recommend going from the little one to the larger one. Also, they grow so fast that they would outgrow that sort of one on the left there within like 2 weeks. So there's no point in doing that. I would just recommend kind of going right there into the big one. I had a lucky opportunity of working very closely with a greenhouse manager at one point many years ago when I was at Concordia University. And she brought forward basically this botanical gardens recipe that she always used for starting seedlings. And essentially, I just wanted to go over a few of what those steps are right now. And then I'm going to do a quick pause to see if there's any chat questions. So these are some branded versions. You can make your own, which is just really you're looking at combination of peat moss, vermiculite, perlite. That really is what you see on the ProMix on the far left there. That's the main part. And then you can add in any sort of nutrition or food essentially for the plant, which is the one part. So it's always 3 parts to 1 part when making your blend. Earthworms castings are something I really recommend for starting seedlings, because a lot of the other composts that you might buy at the store can be really filled with lots of chunky matter, big pieces of wood chip and things like that, that can sort of block seeds from germinating. And earthworms castings are always very fine. They're also the highest nutritional value of any of the sort of manures or composts that I've experienced. So they're really great, but they are more expensive. So you don't absolutely need to. And I would only usually use the earthworm castings when I was in a classroom, just for the establishment of the seedlings right at the beginning with the germination. And then when I'm potting them up into kind of a bigger one that you saw in the picture, I would use a different blend, because the earthworm castings can be like 3-4 times more expensive. So I would usually bring it all together in a Rubbermaid such as this, mix it together. You're going to add water, and on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what you're looking for in terms of consistency. But one note about if you don't use it all up that's in the Rubbermaid, so you do a big mix, you're working with the students, and you're like, oh, okay, I've got a bunch left over in here. Do not seal the lid, because it'll create a mold in there now that you've added in. So the ProMix is sterile, but the earthworm castings aren't, and any of the manures you add in there, and it will start to create a bit of like a fuzzy white mold in there if you seal it up while it's wet. So just one of the things I like to do is just keep it propped, let it dry out a little bit, which usually doesn't take too long because you're not really soaking it that much. But just a little tip, something that I experienced when I was doing this. So I know that I've just moved through a number of different topics right here. So I'm going to pause and see if Madison has any questions in the chat to bring forward.
Yep, there is a question and a lot of different comments. Okay, so firstly, from Oliver mentioning that nutrient component could be finished compost as well. And then Michelle asks, are there seed starting mixes without peat moss?
I've seen it started in coconut coir as another like option. I'd be curious to see if Paul has tried any other different mediums, but I've seen it started in coconut coir as a different one because obviously there can be some there is concerns of the amount of peat that's available. So it is one of those resources that takes a long time to become what it is, and so that is a concern. But I've heard of coconut coir being one option. Does anyone else maybe on the call want to chime in and mention anything that they've also grown out of? Biochar. Okay, Cindy Watts mentions biochar.
Charlene
Nice.
mentioned using a recipe of 1 part worm castings, 1 part coconut coir, and 1 part perlite.
Yeah, so you can also build it out. So the one I have here is kind of like a seedling starting mix, and it's going to be more expensive, but it's quick, it's easy. You know, it's just kind of mix it together, you're good to go. But you can definitely do your own blends, and it definitely is cost saving. And you know, once you start getting really into growing seeds, and maybe you're really loving it, and you're wanting to start unique flowers or even fruits. Trees and different things along those lines, you do end up needing to use different mediums to start them in. So that's also something that's down the road for you to consider. And that's where you can start to create your own little blends there.
One last
looking
question.
at some.
Nancy asked if you recommend adding extra perlite to the seedling mix.
If it's not in the mix, in the blend, then I would add it in. And I've never been really strict about how much that is. In terms of it, I usually will just toss a few handfuls into whatever blend I'm doing, and it's always worked pretty good. So I'm trying to see if I've got a picture there, but it is good to have that. It makes it more airy, the soil, and but I've grown even without it before, and it's been okay. So yeah. And I see Sonia has anyone used the red clay balls to grow in? Sorry, I forgot their name. I have not.
Yeah, I just saw them in a greenhouse being used to start seeds, and they seem to be working really well, but I forget their name. Anyway.
Interesting. If you're adding compost, then is it organic? I have people saying it's not. Well, I mean, the compost can be organic that you're sourcing it from, right? So the source material that made the compost can be organic. So yeah, it's still organic. It will tell you if it's certified or not right on the packaging. Okay, I will move along, but I will pause again in a few minutes to catch any questions. So this is just a quick little one that I also learned from that greenhouse manager. So when adding in water, you're kind of mixing everything together. What you're looking for is an ability to grab the soil, squeeze it pretty hard together, and it hold its form, but not start kind of like profusely dripping water. So you're going to reach in, you're going to grab it. Does it hold its form? If you squeeze it hard, is a lot of water pouring out? Then it's maybe too wet. If maybe 1 drop or something comes off, that's okay. But that's what you're looking for, because these seedling mixes, the peat moss, it needs to have water added into it. You need to blend it together and make it sort of moist. Otherwise, if you try to water into it without doing that first, it'll just overflow and flow out and the seeds go flying. So you have to pre-soak it. That's kind of an important piece of doing that. So just look for that ability to squeeze it and it holds its form, you're good to go. So in the picture, that hand is not really showing what I'm talking about. You would want it to hold more, like a little bit more mucky. So you just play around with it, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but that's just a tip. So for prepping trays, I usually will bring the tray up, sometimes right into the Rubbermaid or right close to the Rubbermaid on top of maybe the lid. And I'm just bringing out soil. I'm kind of flattening it over this. I'm picking up the tray. I'm dropping it, allowing the natural weight to compress. You can do a little bit with your hand pressing down. It's not going to be too compacted as long as you're not really mashing it super hard. I try to get it really flat right along the top, such as you see in this picture. And I tend to like to put the labels sort of at the far end of each of the trays, as you see there. And you can see that the little 6 cells that are there fit a number of 5 by, I think it's 5 rows. No, it's 6 rows, 6 and 6. So it's 72 cells that are going to be. So one of these trays, this is an interesting math aspect of it. One of these 72 cell trays filled, actually, when potted up into the bigger ones that you see on the left there, equals 4 trays. So that's why I really liked that. The enough to fit the 4 trays allows me to start one of these with all of my little seeds, and I germinate them. And then when they're ready to move up into their bigger cells and keep growing to maturity before they get planted out, it equals exactly 4 trays now of the bigger cells. So it's a really kind of perfect fit between this and the larger fit. So that's why I always try to build it in that way. In terms of labeling, you can kind of go 2 ways with this that I've learned. One is using these kind of plastic labels and using a permanent marker or Sharpie. You can actually get these really fancy ones that are oil-based that kind of never will leave the ink, which is really good for tagging fruit trees, especially for their varieties, so that 5 years down the road, even all the weathering won't wear away what variety you initially had. So I do recommend that for any perennials you want tagged. But for inside, just a simple permanent marker such as a Sharpie can do the trick. If you want to go the popsicle stick route, that's totally fine too. Very cheap, but you have to use pencil. Pen will wash off, so it's got to be pencil. It doesn't wear off as fast. I mean, maybe eventually it does. So that's just something to keep in mind. I do recommend trying to label as many of the cells as possible. Like sometimes what I would do at home is just do this. I'd be like, okay, this whole 6 tray thing here is Sun Gold. This next one here is Early Girl. But when it comes to working with kids, it's best to label every one of them, because when you come to that moment where it's time to pot them up, confusion happens every time. So that's just a little tip. So it does mean you sort of end up investing in quite a bit of these or popsicle sticks. And I've done other things like cut up, plastic reusable yogurt containers and different things like that. There's great ways to do recycling to do this. You don't have to go buy new labels, but yeah. I see a couple chats in there. Is there any questions on those pieces, Madison?
Quick question from Paul. Is there any advantage or disadvantage to transplanting tomatoes 2 or 3 times rather than just once?
2 or 3 times rather than once? You mean potting up? Kind of potting up? Mm-hmm. I think it's just, in my experience, sometimes I find it easier to germinate in the smaller cells, the smaller, like the little ones, and then pot up once. I only pot up 1 time into I think it's the 4-inch cells. I just do the pot up, and then the transplant is the next stage. So it's basically about 4 weeks of in the little ones germinating, kind of coming up with their cotyledons. Then I'm potting them up into the 4-inch, and they're in there for another 4 to 6 weeks until they go transplanted out into the field. So yeah, I think that's the only real distinction between the two, is just it sometimes is a little easier to germinate. But I haven't done a lot of experimenting on that. So, okay. Any other questions in there? Is there just the one? Okay. So planting with students, I know Paul will be able to talk a little bit about on his side of things as well, but I really love giving them pencils with erasers on the end, because that's almost the exact amount you want to be making of like a sort of a divot or a dimple into the soil. So the way I instruct it is kind of use your eraser, but only go right up to where you can't see it anymore, because students have a difficulty with planting too deep or not planting at all. And this is definitely something you want to front load and really make sure that they're aware of by doing a demonstration maybe the day before or the week before, because they're pushing it all the way to the bottom. And really most seeds barely need to be beneath the surface at all. And kind of a rule of thumb is the size of the seed is about an indication of how deep it should be beneath the soil. So if you think of like how tall a pea seed is, it can go about that far below. So it kind of doubles its own size under. But something like kale or lettuce that is so teeny, it really just needs a dusting of soil on top. It doesn't need to really be buried. So that's why I kind of like to use this pencil, the eraser there, because it doesn't go too deep and most seeds are going to be totally fine with that. Do recommend trying to get them to be all planting one thing at a time when they do it, but everyone's got different approaches to how they do it. It's always a little bit wild. I like to plant more for sure than what I'm expecting. And a lot of times you end up coming back and sort of doing a little bit of extra work after they've left the class, as probably most teachers know all about. Another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes after those first couple waterings, especially if they didn't plant them deep enough, the seeds will kind of rise up or emerge, or you'll see them, it's the ones you can see that aren't black, and you'll sometimes want to come and just tuck them back under the soil, maybe 1 or 2 waterings later. So it's just, yeah, just something to keep in mind. So in terms of watering maintenance, this is one of kind of my favorite things of doing with the students, to be honest. I find that they really enjoy this kind of activity. It's something that they look forward to each day. So recommend daily watering. In terms of growing seedlings, 16 hours as a minimum is a great amount. I've heard others say 18 hours. I set it on a timer. You want to keep the lights kind of within about 6 inches of wherever the leaves are at. So if you're starting your seedlings and they're germinating, seeds don't actually need light to germinate. They just need warmth and moisture. But I tend to bring the lights down within six inches. And then you kind of like every week or 10 days, I might just like loop the little chain up a little bit higher on it. But you're always trying to keep it in that range. That's what they like the most. Otherwise, they start to get really what is called leggy. They start to kind of like roam, and that's not good for the strength of their stems. Although microgreens are kind of a different story with that. And I've already mentioned about potting up your plants. Once they get to, a little bit of a size, you can start to tell when they're getting bigger. But really, once they're up to about 2 inches, that sort of thing, you can transfer them over. It's pretty easy to tell when they're wanting to go and move to another pot. In terms of watering, you really want to make sure your first watering is pretty heavy so that it kind of soaks down into it, because you're really trying to encourage more and more. Once that seed starts to germinate, you want its roots to be going as deep as possible down so it's not drying out. The surface is always trying to dry out. It can sometimes trick you into actually thinking that there's not much water in the tray. But so the first watering, make sure it's a good heavy watering. You might want to go and do a second watering after the kids are done, depending on how much they soak it. I recommend trays that don't have holes in the bottom. So you can get different trays that hold the cells, and some have holes in the bottom, some don't. I recommend the ones that don't. Otherwise, you're always having water kind of moving through and kind of ending up on your table. I also recommend avoiding planting before weekends, because obviously that's a few days of them not getting water. So plant earlier in the week. But I've got a couple slides about that too. I usually set timing either in the morning or in the afternoon. Just once a day is usually sufficient. I usually will task set group of students, usually in a pair each week. Or maybe they'll just want to do it if you really trust them with it, they can do it. But I'll usually go week by week is how I've done it. And pick up and feel the weight of the tray. It can often tell you exactly how much water really is in those cells. So I would often once you start doing it a lot, you can pick up the tray and be like, oh yeah, there's lots of water right away. Or you pick it up and be like, it may look wet on the surface because they just watered it, but you can tell right away there's basically no water besides that first couple centimeters. So I do recommend considering putting like a tarp or some sort of plastic tablecloth underneath them, because there's always inevitably going to be water sort of splashing around. This is the pump action. I noticed that Paul actually has it up above his right shoulder there, if you see him. So he's obviously using it as well. A little tip I like to do with this was that I kind of get a feel of how much water the trays need. So I would maybe in the first couple days before I start passing it over to the students, I would fill up this thing and see how much water it takes to properly water the tray. And then I take a piece of duct tape and I tape it across there. And I tell the students, I want you every morning to fill it up to the duct tape and empty it. And then this way, that's like a goal, and they can easily know, fill it up to here, get rid of all of it. Because students either tend to be wildly overwatering or wildly underwatering. And often I find underwatering is the issue. So I'm kind of like, nope, keep going, right up to the, finish that whole container right there. So yeah, these can be, I actually remember finding these at the dollar store years ago for very cheap. And mine has been going for many years now. So just a couple little examples of too much watering and too little. On the left, even though the soil looks wet there, it's just after being watered because it's limping. On the right, you'll start to see that kind of green, mossy stuff growing. It's just an example of the soil, the top of the soil being too wet. So probably too much watering too often. It's okay for the surface to dry out, right? So just, both of these, can be brought back to life at this stage. Sometimes people will just take a spoon and scrape that little mossy stuff off, but in my experience, it doesn't harm that much of the plants. But if others feel different about that or experience different, please do let me know. This is an extreme example of seeing the moss, by the way. Domes are pretty amazing. They're really good for the germination aspect and really good for weekends, especially when the plants are young or long weekends. So they can really hold the moisture in there. You really only need one kind of for your main kind of germination tray or whatever you're doing. But yeah, they can be very handy. They're in all the stores wherever you're picking up any of your other trays. You can look to find one of those. Just put it on Friday for the long weekend and it's good to go. It really does the trick. So I recommend it. Even though you only kind of use it for a couple of weeks a year, it can be really handy. Already talked about these details, but I just wanted to make one note of I've heard from some teachers that they don't like to have that fluorescent lights kind of in their classroom. It's kind of too bright and they're sort of figuring out where to put them. You can actually, the 16 hours actually works great from 3 p.m. straight through to 9 a.m. That's actually 16 hours. So if you're kind of wanting it to not really be in your face or around the students, if you find it bright, that's an option that I've seen teachers do. I've also seen teachers hang that sort of reflective silvery stuff that can be sometimes used on front of car windows, and they just kind of wrap it around so it's reflecting the light. That's actually good for the plants, to be honest. So that's just an option. Sometimes it can feel a little bit abrasive. I know some teachers like to have low lighting in their classroom, so just something to consider. I'm not going to go too much into seedling fundraisers, but I did do these at a number of schools when I was living in Montreal. And it was a lot of fun. We would pick out, popular plants. We would grow them in the classroom and we would sell them, and it would offset the costs of some of the, sort of the material costs of having a garden. And it was pretty fun getting the students involved. We would sell them at a parent-teacher night and that sort of thing. So yeah, just a little information on that. You sort of got to really time it to when you're going to be perfect for your frost-free dates, right? So that's just kind of the piece. But we did it and the kids really liked it. And we raised like $300 or $400 for the garden, which was great because it allowed us to buy more compost and replace some of our tools. And the kids thought it was really fun. Madison's going to put a link to this in here, but I just wanted to direct your attention to some of the resources we've created in partnership with West Coast Seeds. So these are regional planting charts we have on our website that talk about best times to be planting for different harvest seasons. And so you can download these and take a peek at them. They're great for kind of working with your students. And they come with these wonderful crop cards that are essentially like the back of a packet of seedlings. So they talk about like the care, how many days of till harvest and things like that, the basic kind of information you'd see on a packet of seeds. And so this is also at that same spot if you go and look for the crop cards, but it's fun and they're really popular items. So these ones are great for if you were to do a fundraiser, they really line up with kind of successful crops and popular crops. I'm getting close to going over time, so I'm going to move through just the last couple here pretty quick, but this is just a rough estimate of what it could cost to start up, your own like wooden project, grow station, pardon me, $350, $400, but it really depends on how big you want to go and scale up. It's just showing a few examples of some of the upfront costs, but so it's not a lot of money, but it does cost something to get this up and going. But if you have a pretty substantial garden and you are already purchasing X amount of dollars in seeds, it can really start to pay for itself within, I found when I was doing it in schools, it was like within 2 to 3 years, I was now saving $200 to $300 every year that I wasn't going out and buying seedlings, which are, $2.50, $3 a piece. Now I'm raising them for something like 30 cents or whatever a piece. But you are going to go out and you're going to buy all the seedling trays and cells, and that is going to be an upfront cost. So. And my last slide here just talks about just some fun ways of engaging students and connecting them to learning. Just easy experiments, observational ideas. You don't have to be a master gardener to be doing indoor growing. And you don't have to be thinking about these big picture, like what is plant cells and all these kinds of things. You can just have them simply doing some measurements and observations. And so just a few different things, getting to plant seeds at different, experiment. How about I plant it deep and I plant mine shallow? How about I water mine every day and this one's only every 3 days, and then starting to measure them and see which one grows faster and have little races and different things like that. So there's really fun, simple stuff you can do. And also it's just really nice to have these plants in the garden, right in the classroom growing. So. Okay, perfect. Maybe I'll just take a quick question here and then I will pass it over to Paul. I'm actually right on time, Paul, so you don't need to feel the need to go quick. Just a reminder, we will have about 10 minutes at the end too, where we can ask additional questions if you want. But Madison, do we have anything lined up in the chat that I could speak to?
Not anything in the chat right now that's new, but if anyone wants to drop anything in or raise their hand, go for it.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to pass it over now to Paul. So Paul has been within the sort of farm to school network for quite some time. I mean, he's been doing this at a school for 10 years. He's based out of Kamloops. He presented at our conference, Farm to School conference last year. He's joined us for the School Garden Mentorship Program in the past. And we're really happy to have him here. He's got a presentation, so I'm going to just stop sharing my screen and bring up his, and I will pass it over.
One question that just dropped in from Michelle. Does anyone have experience with the domes that have lights in them?
Domes with lights? I don't personally. Does anyone else happen to? No? Okay, sorry, here. Just trying to wiggle through my different slides I've got set up. Okay, this should work now. Here we go. Okay.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. That was awesome. I love that you put the piece of tape on it so they know how much water to put in, but you actually let them seed tomato seeds. You're a crazy guy because I would never let anybody touch my tomato seeds.
That's true. They're so expensive now. This was back before they became like a hot commodity.
I think between school and home, I had 24 varieties last year, so nobody gets to touch the tomatoes.
Nice.
They
Can
can
you
touch
see your
the-
presentation good here, Paul?
Sorry?
Can you see the presentation good there on the screen? Just making sure.
Yeah, we're perfect.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thanks, Paul.
Thank you again. Again, Paul Denby, Kamloops. If there's any questions, please drop them in the chat and I'll try and answer them in pauses as we go along here. Been doing this for about 10 years, mostly here at Arthur Hatton in Kamloops. Started out in Logan Lake. Bessie Mochika sent us to Kwantlen down on the coast to go to a Pro D for a day. I had no idea what microgreens were, and all of a sudden we come back and 10 years later we've been supplying restaurants in the area weekly, which is fun and amazing and sometimes a lot of work. So I'll tell you about it. Here we go. Let me know if you have questions. First thing, what are they? They're tiny little plants. They're really good for you. And we grow about 4 or 5 different varieties. We usually try and go between. So we have radish. What you see here is radish. We have peas. We have sunflowers. We also have grown broccoli. Popcorn is a crazy one. It's yellow. You don't put it under the lights. It's pretty fun. So we take these off to the restaurants, and they're able to use them in different dishes, whether it's a cold dish. Often they use the radish, seems to get paired with a lot of steaks and ribs and things like that. And they use them in wraps and salads and whatever. So they find a lot of use for them, and we get money. So we're usually pretty happy with how the transaction comes across. Next slide. So here's an example of one of our restaurants that we sell to, Taste Kitchen at the TCC in Kamloops, and you can see they've stuffed their sandwiches with looks like pea shoots there, and they're fantastic. The nice thing, if you haven't had microgreens before, they taste just like what they are. So the pea shoots are sweet. There's usually the ones kids love. The radish have a little bite to them. Most of the kids don't like those ones. And the sunflowers are kind of right down the middle. And they're the ones that you can use a little bit on top of pizzas or in smoothies, and they're a little bit more versatile than the other ones. Next slide. A lot of people get worried when they start getting into this. I know I've talked to, the reason actually I said to Marcus, like, can we do something next year? Is I was at the conference in UBC, and I heard multiple times throughout the couple of days, people saying like, oh, I tried to grow microgreens and it was really hard, or I wasn't successful, or I'm like, man, that's too bad, because I think once you get it, you kind of get it. And so if you suck with plants, that's okay. I think this will still work for you. It's nice for the kids because it's a short growing period. So the challenges we found with the garden in the past is, you know, you plant it in the spring, and yeah, you have some spring crops and you get a few things done before the summer comes, but most of the time you're not getting that return until you come back in the fall and you're getting some bigger items out of the garden. This is nice because you're looking at 7 to 10 days, and you're going from, hey, I just seeded that last week, to, hey, I'm harvesting this tray right now. So it's a little bit more immediate for them, and I find a little more excitement on the student side out of that as well. And then again, all you need is seeds, dirt, light, water, and you get yourself some microgreens. So I'll go a little bit more in depth in the next slide here, with how exactly what you need and what you need to do to be successful. So one of the things that we've done in the last year, I'd say, is we've switched from the deep trays to the shallow trays. So the one you have in your picture that's a shallow tray. I don't know the depth, but you can tell the difference. Basically, the deep trays are double the depth. At first, we didn't think it was going to work. We weren't super successful the first couple of times we tried it. I didn't think there was enough nutrients in the soil, or that amount of nutrients for the amount of seeds that we were putting in the trays. But we did figure it out. We didn't change much. I think we just did a better job with our cleaning practices, to be honest with you. And that's the Pro Mix we use, which it looks like is pretty similar to what Marcus was showing. So maybe his was organic and this one might not be certified organic, but it's with the microhyzate that we like to use. I'm sure there's other things that would work. I know I've seen people use the coconut coir as well before. I'm sure there's lots of different soil mixes you can make that work. I don't know why gardening is one of those things. Like the rest of my life, I like to try different ways and try and get better. With the gardening stuff, I think I often find like, man, this is really working. I don't really want to mess with this, you know. There's the way my Ducabor bub did it for 60 years. I think I'm going to keep planting my tomatoes this way and doing it the same. So for whatever reason, I think I've stuck with this. Yes, hemp mats. I've seen that as well used before. So there's definitely other options other than this particular bag that I go and buy every single time. But that's what we use here, and that's what we've been using. For seeds, again, lots of options out there for seeds. I know West Coast sells some nice stuff. There seems to be a little bit on the pricier side from what I remember. Mum's Sprouting Seeds out of Saskatchewan. It's a family-owned company. They've been unreal to us as far as like they've given us a discount over the years. They've been awesome. Like I send my order in and away they come. And I haven't had a single complaint from them. The only issue is if you order in large batches, sometimes you can get a batch that's not fantastic as far as its germination rate. But I think that just comes rolling the dice a little bit when you order such large amounts, which we often do. We try and order in large, like 20-pound bags most of the time. Next slide. Materials. This is just like Marcus was saying, the metal racks. I got the metal ones behind me. They're coated with the green plastic coating, or the food safe stuff that they made me buy at the time. But the metal racks are awesome. You can adjust. I like the ones where you can adjust the levels. They are definitely a hassle, like Marcus said, to adjust once the lights are on them. The light that I have picture, the light fixture I have picture there, I pulled that straight from the Home Depot website, where it's where I buy all my stuff. That's a 48-inch housing for it. And then the lights I use, I have a mixture, and it's not necessarily on purpose. It's often because when I go to buy the lights, I forget which one I have most of. So now I have a mixture of the 5000K, the natural light, it's the Philips LED, and the daylight, the 6500. You have to have at least this, again, back when I went to the Pro D down in Kwantlen, you have to have at least the 5000K rating for the microgreens is what we were told. So I got to make sure all my lights are 5000K or higher. But yeah, I'm sure there's other things that work. I'm sure you don't have to have 48-inch lights. That's just what works with the rack systems that I have here and that I have at home. So it's easy to go back and forth, and the trays fit. The depth of the rack is something you want to think about if you're growing microgreens too, because it's nice to get the depth going, enough depth front to back that you can fit the tray in the long way, because then I can fit 4 trays across per 4 feet. So I can squeeze a bunch of microgreen trays in my rack. So I can fit 12 here. I can fit 12 at home. So they would be nice. I guess I saw a bunch of things. Should I pause, Madison? Is there any questions I should hit?
Yeah, a couple things. There was a question of whether lights would be the same for regular seed starts.
Yeah, I use, that's a great question. I use the exact same lights for my seedlings that I start here. So we do 72 tomato starts here, and we do 72 pepper starts here, and those start under these exact same lights behind me. So we don't change anything. And the nice thing about the lights, if you have multiple levels, is the warmth from the lights, the level below them, really helps with the germination of the seedlings above the lights too. So that's why it's nice not to have just the one level, is to have like 2 levels of lights or 3 levels of lights. So you get that warmth coming off the lights from below. Like a lot of people use heating mats. Like I know my mom's old school, she used heating mats under all the tomatoes and pepper starts in her house.
Nice. There's
Was there anything
also,
else?
yeah, there's also someone wondering if cotton wool is still recommended to grow microgreens.
Cotton wool?
Mhm.
I haven't come across that. That's not something I'm familiar with. Like I said, I got kind of stuck once we were able to trial and error our way for the first, like I'd say 2 months. Once we figured out what worked for us, we weren't super excited to change anything. We said, okay, let's stay with what's working. And let's sort of just adjust small things. I'd probably have to take another look at our cost. I know I haven't done that in a while, and see if we could cut any corners or cut any waste or change anything to help us moving forward.
Yep, that's in the chat for now.
Awesome, thanks. Next slide, Marcus. Seed amounts, I won't spend a ton of time on this. I don't know if you want to take a picture with your phone if you're super excited about starting microgreens in the next couple of weeks. I can also share a document or 2 with Marcus that he can send out to anybody that's interested, or you can reach out with me directly. But these are the amounts that we have decided work per tray for us. And again, this is just what works for us. There's a million different ways to do it. But this is what works for us. So this is the amount of dry seed that you would soak. Just looking, and even radish, I think we're down to maybe 35 grams. Like we might have altered it since I've written this. Beets, you can see at the end there. I made a little note. Please only grow those if you absolutely hate yourself. Those are a nightmare, like a nightmare to harvest. That's them in the picture. And I don't know if you can see them in the picture, but there's these tiny little husks that are like, I don't even know how to describe them. They're awful. They're absolutely terrible. And so I couldn't get the kids to harvest them like super successfully. And the seeds are expensive, and I would end up doing that. And every week I'd be sitting there harvesting a tray of beets in the classroom, just miserable. So please don't grow those unless you're going to charge like 2 or 3 times what you charge for everything else, because those are ridiculous. Sorry, that's my rant. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so here's okay, how do I do it? Here's how you do it. You have to weigh the seeds. We talked about those dry seed weights on the last slide there. So that's the amount that you want. You want to scale. I don't think I mentioned that in equipment. Just any like kitchen scale that gives you grams would be amazing. So you want to weigh out your seeds. I just use old jars to weigh out my seeds in. I soak the seeds. I have 6 to 8 hours. That's loose. That's a loose 6 to 8 hours. Longer is better than shorter. But when you get them from Mom's sprouting seeds, most of the packages have how long to soak that type of seed for. And you usually use just like room temperature water. If it's cold, if it's winter, I'm more likely to use maybe some warm water. But I mean, not a big difference. You're going to fill the trays right to the top, nice and flat with your Pro Mix. In my case, you're going to water the soil. So you want nice and wet. I usually pack it down, especially for the smaller seeds, the radish and the arugula and the broccoli and those kinds of things. You want to pack it down so it's nice and flat, because when you go to spread the seeds out, if it's not packed down, it gets mixed in and it's a bit of a nightmare. So if you pack it down, it needs to be wet, not like completely saturated, but wet. And then you put the seeds on top of the soil. And this was the part where I was like, this doesn't make any sense. How can you put the seeds on top of the soil? But you put them on top. Something like peas, because they're round, they want to roll around. So you might want to push them a little bit, just so they don't roll around when you go to pick up the tray. And then again, this is the method we were taught. This is what we stuck with. We actually stack them in the dark for 3 days. So 72 hours. So we'll take a tray of peas, and we'll take the next tray of peas and we'll put it right on top of it. And so we have, 4 trays stacked on top of each other. Don't do more than 6 trays, because then you come in 3 days later after your weekend and they're tipped over on the floor because they pushed up so high. That's definitely happened before. But you want to stack them. I usually use old books. We have old textbooks that are no longer used because they're old textbooks, and we use those just to simply stack on top of our trays to weigh them down a little bit. 3 days later, we uncover them. We hit them with water. We put them under the light, and then we leave them there for about 7 days, watering whenever they need it. Usually once a day is enough, especially with the shorter trays. The thin ones that we're using now, they get dried out a little bit quicker. So definitely once a day for those guys. And then we're harvesting. So our schedule, just so you know, Friday we seed. So this Friday we're going to seed. We're only seeding 5 trays right now. It's kind of nice. So we're going to seed our 5 trays. On Monday afternoon, I'm going to uncover them, water them, put them in the lights. And then the following Monday, those get harvested. And so we constantly have, like, as we take trays off on Mondays to harvest, we're uncovering new trays every Monday also to put under the light. So it's just a cycle that continually goes. Okay. Yeah, I think we're good there. Next slide. We're almost done. There's my schedule. I covered that. Those are sunflowers down on the bottom, so we can go straight past the next slide. I got excited, went a bit early. Scaling for success. So our costs are a little bit less than $2 a tray at last calculation. We wholesale those to people, to the restaurant, for $13 a tray, which is, by the way, ridiculously low. Like if you're in the lower mainland market, you're probably like, you could sell them for $20 a tray, no problem. We don't do them by weight, we do them by tray. So it cuts down to like a lot of the trying to figure out, like, let's weigh them, let's do them. No, we're just selling, bag it, send it off, away we go. And then the market, when we do go to the market, which is usually only once or twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring, we can usually sell a tray for $20 to $25, because again, we're selling them in smaller bags and we can get away with it. So I think that was us this fall at the market selling stuff. And we usually just go once in the fall and we can pull $500 or $600 in that visit, but that's not just on microgreens, that's on all the other stuff from the school garden as well. Next slide. Student involvement. So this is probably the last one I need to cover. Delegate and front load. This is something, again, I'm not always fantastic at. Nobody touches tomatoes, but microgreens we're okay with. These are all the things I can have students doing, and I try and get them doing as much as possible, because if I don't get them doing it, that means I have to do it. And that means I don't like it very much. So washing trays, that's definitely something they can do. They can fill the trays with dirt. I usually have a crew of, rotating crew of like 5 to 10 people that can seed for me. Uncovering and watering is a no-brainer. Harvesting, I gotta be a little bit tight about like who I have harvesting, and I gotta kind of quality control check the harvesting a little bit. The biggest thing is making sure the scissors are sharp. Those things get dull so often, it's insane. So stuff like that is sort of falls on me. And then the accounting, I don't mind them sort of tracking how much is coming in if we want them to. And then most importantly, like, what do we want to do with the money? Like, how do we want to use the money that comes into our classroom? Is it for tools? Is it for new equipment, new scissors, for example? Is it for stuff for the garden outside? So what do we want to do with that? Is sort of the last piece that I like to involve the kids with. Next slide. And then big concept, there's some kids seeding microgreens from a few years ago on top of the soil. Those are the thick trays there. So there you go. Those are thick trays. We use ones half as deep, which means our soil costs are cut in half, which saved us a bunch of money because the soil costs went through the roof. I think a bale went from $30 to like $45 the last 3 years. And I think that's it. Yes, done.
Nice. Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome.
We have a couple minutes to squeeze in some of the questions that we've seen come into the chat. Madison, do you have any lined up for Paul?
Yep. The first one is, do you need to wash your microgreens before eating them?
Before you eat them?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't, to be honest. We bag them away we go, but I think it's like any food that we receive. We know the restaurants are responsible for washing the microgreens upon arrival, just like they would any other food they receive. But I will cut them out of the tray and eat them on the spot because all we do is use water and soil at this point. We don't use any other materials on the microgreens. So I feel pretty confident about it. Washing your food before you eat them is probably a pretty good life tip, though.
Sonia's asking how you first approached restaurants, how you first built the relationships.
Yeah, that's probably the trickiest part. I got a little bit lucky, I think, with the relationships. David Toombs here in town, that was a chef at Terra Restaurant, and now he's down on the coast. He was probably the guy that got me in, and then I got lucky because his chef tree that branches out all over the city started contacting me here and there. But I mean, they all talk to each other. The restaurants all talk to each other. If you go in and say, hey, who's your microgreen supplier? Do you have a microgreen supplier? If you take samples in and they're quality samples, they'll say, cool, how much, like how often, what can we do? And most places are pretty receptive, especially when it's coming from school, especially when students are involved, especially when the money is coming back to the students. I think there's a ton of opportunity. If I wanted to, we could go out in Kamloops and have 5 more restaurants get on board, but we're just not interested in that much work every week right now.
Okay, and last question from Sandra, is a high school student from Ontario, wondering how you can adopt all of this to work for a high school. From what it seems, this is all very much elementary school oriented.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you could scale it pretty hard in a high school, especially connected to a foods program or a sustainability program. I think the scaling possibilities are kind of crazy. And then all of a sudden you're putting in the onus on students in the classroom to go out and possibly solicit some restaurants and reach out to people in the community to see what's interested. And remember, it's not just restaurants. I mean, you could easily sell these weekly to people, to parents or families or whoever from the community. So I think there's a lot of money to be made out there for schools or for programs using microgreens as your sort of jumping off point that hasn't been tapped into. So I think there's a ton of opportunity at the high school level.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul. We're at time right now, and I don't want to hold people up from getting on with their day. Just wanted to bring up a couple last slides. One, just to let you all know about our school garden mentorship program, which supports teachers who are engaged in attending to or developing school gardens. We're having our second workshop next week. Madison's going to put the link in the chat there if you want to jump in and kind of learn about the different ways of managing your garden. And also, oops, there we go. If you wanted to stay connected with us, we've got all our social media that you can follow. We also have our newsletter and regional listservs. Madison will also put that in the chat if you want to sign up for the newsletter. It kind of lets you know when all of these different events and things like that are coming and happening. So yeah. Yeah, I wanted to again thank Paul for joining us. Always great to learn about what you're doing there and just kind of how innovative the idea of getting out into the market and selling to restaurants. That's really neat. Like I can just imagine what kids, the sort of the empowerment they must feel of like being able to engage in those ways. Like we never, you know, when we're little, we don't get to kind of have that sort of responsibility. So I think it's really exciting to hear about that kind of angle that you've taken with it. So we did record this presentation. We will share it out after. Paul has mentioned that he might have some resources. We'll tag that in for those who came to it. So stay tuned for those who attended. We have, I believe, your emails when you register, so we'll be able to send that out. We'll also upload this video to our YouTube channel. So yeah, thanks again, everyone. For those who are going to embark on doing either of these, good luck. We wish you all the luck, and we really appreciate all of you who joined us today because we know that you're passionate such as we are. So all the best moving into the spring. And if you have a garden, good luck with that too. So take care, everyone.